Hello, this is my presentation for APN 620 on the food and culture of France. So before we begin, I wanted to go over a few learning objectives that I will discuss. You will learn about the traditional foods and eating habits in France, also how the current eating practices in France and in French people who have moved to the US have been impacted by the Western diet. And finally, you will understand how French food and culture affects how a nutrition professional in the US goes about a counseling session with a client. First, let's go through some background information on France. As you can see on the map to the right, France is located in Western Europe. The population is just above 67 million, and the primary language that is spoken is French, but there are dialects that differ slightly from region to region. The main religion is Catholic, which is practiced by more than half of the French population. Some traditional foods. France contains a lot of different regions, as you will see in the next slide, all that have varying traditional foods. For example, in southern France, which is around Nice, two traditional dishes are ratatouille, which is shown below, is a vegetable stew. Not the mouse or the mouse or rat, whatever it is in the Disney movie. And cardoon. It's a vegetable similar to an artichoke that's cooked in an almond sauce, and the dish that's made with it is served on Christmas Eve. To the right is a picture of a cardoon. To me, it looks similar to a combination of celery and an artichoke. Crepes are traditional to Western France, and those are thin pastries that are made with flour. They resemble flat pancakes, but can be stuffed with sweet or savory fillings. And crepes are traditionally eaten on February 2nd, which is a holiday called the Feast of the Virgin. And then another popular food in France that is served before a meal is escargot, which is cooked snails. So this is the map I was talking about, showing all of the different regions of France, such as Normandy, Brittany, and of course you can see Champagne up there. An interesting tidbit I learned from one of my coworkers who was just on vacation in Paris and did some touring with guides. She learned that the champagne we drink here in the US isn't actually champagne because it's not grown from grapes in the Champagne region. The champagne we drink is sparkling wine, but it's made from grapes from other areas that are usually used to make different types of wine. So speaking of wine and cheese, many people associate France with wine and cheese because they're widely consumed here. Also, you can kind of see the topography in this map, but it's got a lot of mountainous regions and does have a varying climate, which makes it or allows France to produce tasty wines and flavorful cheeses. There are 17 different wine regions in France, and France produces about 450 unique types of cheese. So if the French people consume such large amounts of wine and cheese, it would make sense that they would be obese or have higher rates of obesity than the US, but they don't. It's actually sorry about that. It's actually about half of the rate of the US, and this is known as the French paradox. With cheese and wine being consumed, French people do take in higher amounts of saturated fat, but they still have a relatively low rate of heart disease and obesity. There are various theories that attempt to explain the French paradox, but there isn't one set answer. One theory is that the wine that they consume with meals is cardioprotective due to its high polyphenol content. So traditional eating patterns. The French eating pattern is another theory to explain the French paradox because Typically, they eat 3 meals a day without much snacking in between. However, growing children have after school snacks, which are called lagute or katra, and that translates to the fourth hour. And these snacks consist of foods like cookies, bread and jam, or chocolate. Each meal is a formal meal and it's eaten with a family. It's meant to be enjoyable and a social event. Their main meals are le petit déjeuner, which is breakfast, and this is usually a lighter meal consisting of bread, cereal, yogurt, and coffee. And then for lunch, which is called le déjeuner, is a more intricate meal consisting of 3 courses. The first course, called l'entrée, is called l'entrée, and then they have the main dish, which is called le plat, and then either a cheese or a dessert pastry is served. Le dîner, so they have lunch and then dinner, and then after that they have the dessert pastry. Dinner is served a similar fashion to lunch with the 3 courses. Wine is served with each meal and sometimes even with each course of each meal to help bring out the flavors of the food. The meals are prepared by the women, and they use fresh produce, unlike the U.S., where takeout, delivery, and frozen meals are the usual and often eaten watching TV or with everyone on their phones. So the current food practices, despite the traditional French meal patterns with the 3 meals a day, it does appear that France and the French who have come to the U.S. Are conforming to the Western diet, consisting of fast-paced, more mindless snacking throughout the day, if it's not an official meal, and eating on the go. Also, macronutrient intake of the French is starting to match that of that which is the average in the U.S. The chart to the right shows a detailed breakdown of the macronutrient intake in an average French diet. However, to compare it to the macronutrient intake for Americans provided by the CDC, I added the carbohydrates and sugar since it appeared to be counted in the same category. And I did the same for fat as well. I added the monosaturated, polyunsaturated, and saturated fat to be total fat for the French breakdown. So you can see that the percentage of macronutrient intake for France and the U.S. are pretty similar, other than the U.S. consuming a bit more carbohydrates and France consuming a higher amount of fat, which is mostly saturated, and that coincides with the French paradox that I mentioned previously. As a result of the French adopting a more Western-style diet, they are also experiencing an increase in obesity. In 2001, the obesity rate in France was 14%, which is almost double what it was 10 years before that. Even though these rates are only half of what they are in the U.S., it is still alarming that they're showing an upward trend. So as a result, the French government reacts. Due to this rise in obesity and its related health issues like diabetes and heart disease, in 2001, the Ministry of Health in the French government reacted by implementing the French National Nutrition and Health Program, which is abbreviated PNNS, and this stands for Programme National Nutrition Santé. This program contains various nutrition goals related to health, such as consuming a certain number of fruits and vegetables, getting a certain amount of physical activity, and maintaining a certain level of various biomarkers like cholesterol, BMI, and blood pressure. Additionally, the European World Health Organization Food and Nutrition Action Plan for 2015 to 2020 calls for countries in Europe to start using front-of-pack labeling. As a result, France has decided to use a Nutri-Score system, which you can see below, and that classifies foods and beverages into about 5 categories of nutrition quality. The foods in the green end of the spectrum, or grade A, are healthier choices than those to the right, or the red end, or grade E. And this method of labeling is a way to help France's consumers make healthier choices, since they don't need to necessarily read the nutrition facts or be health literate to choose better foods based on what color or grade its nutrition score is, or Nutri-Score. So in my perspective as a future nutrition professional, I'm bound to encounter clients from other countries, which might result in some nutrition concerns based on their food selection. So if a client practices the more traditional French eating patterns with the minimal snacking, moderate portion sizes, and the more mindful eating, there wouldn't really be too much of a nutrition concern in general, unless the specific individual has poor eating habits. However, since the traditional French eating patterns and behaviors are blending together with the Western lifestyle, the heavy consumption of cheese and wine may be of concern if they are consumed frequently and in larger portion sizes. Cheese is high in saturated fat and sodium, and wine, even though it's been shown to be healthy when drank in moderation, the typical glass poured at home and at most restaurants is usually more than the standard one glass of wine, which is 5 ounces. Also, if the client is consuming longer meals that include numerous courses, which they're used to traditionally, they may be more likely to consume multiple glasses of wine. And with the larger portion sizes that are being served, they may be likely to overconsume calories. So the main nutrition concern that I can think of would be excess calorie consumption. So topics that would need to be addressed in a counseling session would be the frequency that they consume different foods, what a typical portion size is for them, the duration, frequency, and intensity of any physical activity that they get. And another topic I would address would be mindful eating, making sure that they are staying present during their meal times so that they are aware of the tastes and textures of their food, as well as how they feel before, during, and after eating. And some cultural components that I would need to consider when counseling a client from France. I would say the biggest cultural component that would most likely be the language barrier. And if this is the case, I could look to using an interpreter if the client's comfortable with that. If they do speak English or a little bit of English, I would need to be cognizant of their vocabulary and their health literacy because I wouldn't want them to misinterpret my questions or suggestions, and similarly, I wouldn't want to misinterpret what questions they have for me, or their concerns, or any of their values that they're telling me. Also, I would need to step outside of my worldview and perspective of health as I know it in my life and in the United States to help eliminate any unknown or underlying bias or misconceptions. It would also be important for me to understand what the client values regarding their diet, their social interactions, like their family and friends, as well as their health. Even if I were to increase my cultural competency by doing more research on the French culture, since each person is unique, I would need to be open-minded towards the experiences and knowledge of each client. So here are the references that I used to make this presentation, and thank you for listening.